In our last video, we talked about the 13 major categories of disabilities or exceptionalities that are recognized both under federal law and in Minnesota. In this section, we're going to talk about the percentages. How many students have these different exceptionalities? So the most recent data I could find comes from the 2019-2020 school year. And this tells us that around 14% of all students nationally received some sort of special education services. This varies dramatically from state to state. I believe one of the sources I saw said that I think it's New York that has the highest percentage, around 20% of students, whereas Texas has the lowest percentage, around 10% of students. And that significant variation doesn't mean that things are more or less likely in those states. It simply means that states can make it either harder or easier to get special education services. The most common disability by far is what is called specific learning disabilities, which we'll learn about next week. Basically, a specific learning disability is something that impairs a student's progress in a specific subject, such as reading or writing or math computation or spelling or nonverbal communication. There's actually a list of things in the regulations that qualify this. This is not a student who has an intellectual disability. If you were to give the student an IQ test, which we'll also talk about briefly next week, the student's intelligence would be found normally to be average or above average, even far above average in some cases. And the traditional definition of learning disability was that the student's classroom achievement did not match their abilities. So we would expect them to be achieving at grade level, for example, because their intelligence was around average, but they were achieving far below grade level. It might even be where we expect them to achieve above grade level because of their intelligence, but they're achieving slightly below grade level. Speech or language impairment is 19%. That is the second most common. That was my disability in school. I received speech services from in elementary school until like 4th or 5th grade. I couldn't say my CH sounds, among other things. I found my IEP, in fact, a few years ago. Other health impairment is the next most common. And again, the reason this is so large is specifically because of ADHD. The fourth most common exceptionality nationally is autism. And I want to point out, these percentages aren't percentages of all students. These are students in special education, students who are receiving special ed. So this is not saying that 11% of all students have autism. That is not true. It is saying that of the 14% of students who receive special ed services, 11% have a diagnosis of autism. This is a number that has dramatically increased over the past 20 or 30 years. Developmental delay, which is that early childhood one, birth through age 7, is at 7%. Intellectual disability is one of the areas that's been decreasing over the years. It's currently at 6%. Emotional disturbance is 5%. Multiple disabilities, 2%. Deaf and hard of hearing, 1%. Orthopedic impairments, 1%. And then these other categories are very, very small. Visual impairments, including blindness, less than 0.5%. Traumatic brain injury, there should be a less than sign in front of it. That's also less than 0.5%. Deaf-blind, also less than 0.5%. That number is inaccurate. That's from older data. I would need to delete that before I upload the actual PowerPoint. But it's very, very, very rare. I saw the numbers in Minnesota. I think there's around 100 students in Minnesota altogether who have deafness and blindness together like that. As I mentioned, these numbers are increasing over time, and I hope you can see this okay. There's where I got it from, so you can use the link if you want to look at it yourself. Again, in 1976, when we first started, required special education around the country. About 8% of all students had some sort of disability. That number increased throughout the 80s and 90s. And then in the 21st century, what we see is that it, for a long time, was right around 13%. In fact, it was that way from 2000, 2001, all the way up through 2016 to 2017 is when it started to increase a little bit. For the most part, during this time frame, we were in about 0.3% of 13%. Since 2016, that number is increasing. And the most recent numbers I saw for 2019-20, this is up to, I think, 14.4 or 14.5%. So the number of students receiving special education services is increasing, not just as a number, but as a percentage. So here we have it by category. Again, I know this is probably really hard to see on your screen, as if you're not up close to it. Feel free to look online if you want. I just want to, again, sort of show this. These are now all students. So among all students in our schools in 2018-19, 14.1% had some sort of disability that was receiving special education services. They had an IEP. Notice autism. In 2000, 0.2% of all students were classified as having autism. In 2018, that number was jumped to 1.5%. That is a significant increase. Now, I know those of you who are math people, this is not a great chart because it doesn't go year by year. Like we have 76 and then 80 and then 90, then 2000, then 2008, and then we go year by year from 2008. So keep that in mind as we're looking at trends. But even when we look at 2008 to 2018, where we do have yearly increases, this percentage has increased each year since 2008, and it has more than doubled as a percentage since 2008. Deaf-blindness, very rare. Developmental delays, that early childhood sort of catch-all category, has also been increasing slightly. Emotional behavior disturbance at the national level has actually started to decrease, but it's been pretty steady for most of the decade. Hearing impairment is also pretty steady throughout this entire period. Intellectual disability. Intellectual disability has significantly decreased. When special ed first started, 2% of all students were classified as having intellectual disability. Today, less than 1% are. This is one reason we think why numbers for autism have increased. Some students who in the 1970s or 1980s would have been classified as having an intellectual disability, today instead are classified as having autism. That is one possibility. Multiple disabilities remains relatively consistent. So does orthopedic or physical impairments. Other health impairments is another area that has significantly increased, and again, this increase is largely, but not entirely, due to ADHD. Again, looking at just the past 10 years of consistent data or so, this has gone from 1.3% of all students in 2008 to 2.1% in 2018. This is a category that's not used anymore. It was only used temporarily for preschool disabled. Specific learning disability is another category that initially increased a whole bunch and has since fallen back for the most part. It sort of peaked in this data around 2000 and it's gone down since then. That's probably partially due to changes in how we refer students for special education. It may also have something to do with the increased prevalence of autism or not. Speech language, right around just under 3%, fairly consistent. Traumatic brain injury is one of the low incidence areas, as is visual impairment. How about in Minnesota? This data comes from the state. Minnesota is actually above the national average in terms of students in special education. In fiscal year 2019, just over 16% of all students in Minnesota were in special ed. Looking at trends in Minnesota, this is by district type. And what we see is that between fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2019, the percentage of students in special ed in the Minneapolis district and the St. Paul district actually dropped quite a bit. But at the same time, we saw an increase in other school types across the state. So that right now, as a percentage, large non-metro schools, these would be schools with, I'm not sure this is by school or by school district, but schools with populations, or schools or districts, whatever it may be, of populations over 2,000 are the most likely to have students in special education. The least likely here is charter schools, but this is a data that is, you have to be really cautious with charter schools, because charter schools are not necessarily required to provide special education services, and they aren't required to take every student who walks through their doors. Some may choose to do that, but typically charter schools are not required to do that. And so this is why you're going to see often, if we break things down by charter, you're going to see very significantly smaller numbers. If we broke these down by private schools, it would be similar. You would see smaller numbers because private schools don't have to take, obviously, every student who walks through their doors. And often private schools will not provide special education services, particularly if they are severe needs. And again, that varies from school to school. Looking at category Minnesota, and this is, I took this pie graph from data from the education department, and the original pie graph had these percentages chopped off. This wasn't my screenshot. But most common in Minnesota, 23% of kids in special ed in Minnesota are there because of a specific learning disability. That's the most common. Speech language is about 16%. Autism is 14%. Developmentally delayed, and again, this is the early childhood one, birth to age 7, is 13% also. Emotional behavior disorder is 11%. And these are the most common categories. I missed other health impairment. Other health disabilities or other health impairments, this is largely ADHD. This is also at 13.6%. Missed that slice of the pie. So these are the big ones. These are the ones you are most likely to see in your classrooms, no matter what you're teaching, which we'll talk about as we go forward. In Minnesota, these over the past 6 years or so are the areas where we saw the biggest increase in autism, in developmentally delayed, in learning disabilities, in other health disabilities or other health impairments, and in emotional and behavior disorders, which is actually interesting. All of the other categories also saw increases. They just weren't as large. And I'm not sure if the state decided to figure these based on sheer numbers or on percentages. I like the number of increase or the percentage of increase. I'm assuming it was based on percent, but I might be wrong. 3 categories are actually declining in the state. Physical impairment is slightly declining, although it did go up from 2016 to 19. And then developmental and cognitive disabilities, or in other words, intellectual disabilities. So severe and profound, these are students with very, very, very significant developmental or cognitive issues. Those numbers are slightly going down. And the mild to moderate category is actually going down pretty more significantly from a percentage base, it looks like from this graph. I want to end this part of the presentation by talking briefly about gifted. Gifted is not considered special education by federal law, although some states do classify gifted as special education. Minnesota does not. Minnesota does not require gifted services. Minnesota does not require a gifted endorsement for teachers. That puts Minnesota in the minority of states around the country. Gifted is still considered an exceptionality. It is not, however, considered a disability. So in the final part of this video, we will talk about the goals of special education. That's something to look forward to for part 3.